right, hello everybody. This is Mr. Rogers. Welcome to AP Statistics. This is the first section of the first chapter of our book. And we're introducing the idea of statistics here, what we're going to do in statistics, and the very beginnings, we're going to be looking at different types of graphs and different types of data, different types of variable. And so let's just dive right in. All right, so data analysis is a big part of what we do in AP Statistics. Statistics in general is just we're collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data. Now we'll get into the term statistic, the class statistic. We're going to collect, analyze, and interpret data, make inferences, and that sort of thing. The word statistic itself means, in this class, means something that we're going to measure about a sample in the hopes of saying something intelligent about a population. We'll get into that more in a later slide. All right, so data analysis, we're going to learn how to organize, display, summarize, and then maybe look at the data and say, isn't that interesting? You know, ask some sort of question about that data. All right, individuals, these are the set of maybe they're people that we're interested in and that we have a set of data about. The variable is some sort of characteristic that we're interested in the variable, in the particular individuals. It could be what is the individual's height, what is their eye color, how much does each mouse in the population weigh, that kind of thing. All right, so these are all variables that we're going to be interested in. Weight, eye color, height, that kind of thing. There are two types of variables. The first one is a categorical variable. So this is something that you're going to be able to put the different individuals into a specific group or category. For example, eye color. Right? You might say, oh, what grade are you in? Are you a sophomore, junior, or senior, right? That would be categorical variable. The other type of variable is a quantitative variable. So often this will be some sort of number, but a number that makes sense to do to do calculations, or in this case, it suggests taking the average. So, for example, I might have everyone's zip code listed. Well, zip codes are made up of numbers, but you can't really say what's the average zip code of all the students in class. That doesn't really make sense. So even though numbers might be involved in the particular value of a variable, it might still be categorical. You know, think about a telephone number, right? So a telephone number has numbers, obviously, because we call it a telephone number, but we think of that more as categorical, because you wouldn't like, oh, what's the difference between your telephone number and my telephone number? You don't do calculations with them. So they tend to be more categorical in variables. Okay, so generally categorical are going to be things like eye color. Quantitative is going to be something that you can measure, like the height or the weight of a mouse, that kind of thing. A variable can take on lots of different values, but sometimes we're interested in how often a particular value shows up in what we call our distribution. So a distribution can be like this, sort of listed in sort of table form. In this case, we're interested in what's the miles per gallon, or MPG, for various cars. But what we'll really want to do more often than not is, instead of having it in sort of this table form, is we'll show that distribution in a form of a graph. In this case, a dot plot. So a dot plot of the miles per gallon. And so you can see by looking at this very quickly that there are 3 cars in our list that have a miles per gallon of 25 mpg. So like we can see that here, 25, there's 3 of them. That's a little bit harder to to collectively look at when you're looking at the table. So a graph is a good way of visualizing the data very quickly and being able to make patterns, recognize patterns in the data. For example, not very many cars are below 20 miles per gallon. Nearly all the cars are above 20 miles per gallon. A little bit harder to say that so quickly by looking at this table. All right, so we can take data and we want to look at the relationships among the variables that we have in our data list. So we often will want to start with a graph to see the relationship between or how frequent a particular value shows up. So graph's a good way, but also besides this table and graph, we will also want to look at number summaries. So what's the average GPA? We can visualize sort of from the dot plot, we can look at kind of where the middle is, but sometimes we want to know exactly the number summary. So X bar, which is the average, how many data values there are, and there's 24. Standard deviation, how spread out the data is something that we're going to be interested in. So this kind of display that you see in the bottom left here is what we will get from our graphing calculator. So just a note on graphing calculators. Graphing calculator is required for this class. So if you do not have a graphing calculator, you must get one. Mr. Rogers, often have a handful of graphing calculators that I will lend out to students for the year if you are having difficulties getting your hands on one. You know, money sometimes is a little tight. Your parents can't afford to buy a graphing calculator. They can be rather expensive. I, in the past, have found some used ones on Amazon that are in pretty good condition and that maybe cost 50, 60, 70 bucks. As opposed to going to Staples and buying a new one, which is generally well over $100. I'll give you more details in class about the type of calculator you should get, but if you have any questions, come see me. You definitely have to have a calculator. It's not optional. All right, so this current slide is sort of what we do in a nutshell. The whole point of this class is eventually to get to something called inference. And so here we have the beginnings of a Venn diagram. So we have the population. Now this population could be the seniors at Montclair High School. This population could be the mice, a particular species of mice. It could be the soda cans that were filled at a Coca-Cola bottling plant last Tuesday. So population can be a lot of things. It's just what we're interested in measuring some aspects or characteristics about. All right, so what we do generally, instead of looking at the entire population of soda cans, for example, we will take a sample. So we want this generally to be a random sample and a representative sample. So we'll spend a whole chapter on how to properly sample, but just for now, let's assume that it's a representative sample of the population. And what we will do is we will collect data from the sample rather than from the whole population. Generally, it takes too long. The population might be just too big. In the case of soda, we wouldn't want to take and measure the volume of every can filled, because then we wouldn't have any soda cans to sell. So we would take a sample of soda cans, open them up, dump them out into a very precise beaker, and calculate the exact volume that the canning machine is filling the cans with. And so we're collecting data from the sample. What is the average volume of soda in the cans that we sampled off of the soda line? All right, we look at that data, and we look at that data, we analyze it, we come up with the average, how spread out the volumes are, and then we can say something important, hopefully, about the population. So are all the cans being filled to a volume that is acceptable? If the volume in the cans in our sample is acceptable, then we're going to infer that the population, all the rest of the cans, are being filled properly. All right, so let's start with an example of categorical variables. So the categorical variable here is the format of a radio station. So we could have adult contemporary, adult standards, contemporary hits, country, news and talk, and so on. All right, so the variable is the format. And then, it takes on lots of different values, the different types of radio stations. And then we have counts. Now, the count and frequency are synonymous terms. So I can say, what is the count or what is the frequency? Same thing. Now, the next table over, notice that we no longer have counts, but we have the percent. And so percent of the radio stations that are adult contemporary is 11.2%. The percent of radio stations that have a format that is adult standards is 8.6%, and so on. So percent and the term relative frequency are also synonymous terms. All right, so sometimes we'll use counts in our tables and our graphs. Sometimes we'll use percents, and we'll sort of learn some ideas about when to use which one. Sometimes it's up to you. Sometimes one is required over the other. All right, so what kinds of graphs can we make? So we could make a bar graph. So this is the bar graph that represents, in this case, we have counts. And then another type of graph is a pie chart. And so pie charts tend to have percentages in them, and bar graphs tend to have counts, or you can also have relative frequencies or percents as well. Okay, so these are two examples of graphs that we use for categorical data. Okay. All right, a couple of things to be careful with. When you're making a bar graph, each bar should be the same width. Don't make some bars wider than others. Also, bar graphs should have spaces between the bars. Okay, we'll talk more about the difference between a bar graph and another graph that we'll get to when we talk about quantitative variables and something called the histogram. But bar graphs should have gaps between the bars, and each bar should be equally have an equal width. All right, and then sometimes to be kind of cute, we use what's called a pictograph. This is not something that we should be using. You see this sometimes in the USA Today newspaper, or some other magazine. Sometimes they try to be cute and they use a pictograph, but you have to be careful. So for example, a bad pictograph is here. It's just a graph that says not a graph, sorry, a table, and it says fruit collected, right? So this table, well, I guess it's kind of a graph. It's a pictograph, and it says banana, oranges, and cherries. Well, you can look, if you're careful, you can see like, oh, 4 of each were collected. However, it looks like the cherries, because they're so small, they seem to appear to be a smaller frequency, right? The banana is further out, and so it looks like if it's a bar graph, this one's further out, the apples, and then the cherries are pretty small. So your eye looks at area and compares area, gives weight to larger areas. So the apples are obviously much bigger than the cherries, and so it looks like there's more apples than there are cherries, but there's really just 4 of each. So you really should be careful and not use this kind of cutesy pictograph. Another example would be, like, the amount of trash collected over time. The bar in each case should be just getting more vertical, but in this case, we make the trash can, because we want the trash can to look normal, we make the trash can not just taller, but also wider. So it has a bigger proportion, right? So the bigger area. So we want to keep the image proportionate. And so as a result, the first trash can is 100, let's, I don't know, it's 100 tons, let's say. And then the last one is 250, but the area represented by the trash can is so much larger. So your eye puts more weight into that, even though it's only 100 versus 250. The 250 looks much bigger, much bigger because of that keeping of the image proportionate. And so we don't want to do this. So don't make cutesy kind of graphs like this. Bar graphs are what we would really want to use in both those cases. And then one more thing to be careful of with bar graphs. So here is a bar graph, and it is the average debt per household, I don't know, say in a city or something. And let's say I'm a politician and I took office in 2009. So 2009, I took office and the debt in the town was rather high. And I ran on a platform to be mayor. I ran on a platform to reduce household debt. And this graph makes it appear that I really dramatically reduced household debt. But there's a problem with this graph. And again, it's the idea that your eye looks at the area and puts weight to bigger areas. So if you look at this graph back in 2009, it's huge compared to, 3 years later in 2012, it's minuscule, right? I mean, it looks like the debt is completely gone. But this is a sort of misrepresentation. And basically the key is this does not start at 0 here. All right, so you have to be careful. Should this graph really look like? Something like this. All right, so you can see, yes, okay, household income debt did decrease some, but not by that much. Maybe 10%, not 90% like the previous graph shows, right? The huge difference in these bars makes us feel like, oh, it's a dramatic decrease. But if we look at what really happened, because we are starting at 0, which is what we should always start with a bar graph, in 2009, it was just shy of 9,000. 2012, it was about 7,000. So it decreased about a little less than 2,000, maybe 20%, something like that, but not as dramatic as what it showed over in the other graph. All right, so you just have to be careful. That first graph is a graph that you might see, right? Politicians might use that to show that they're really doing a good job. The people who maybe don't think the politician's doing a great job would certainly use a correct graph like this second one. All right, so we're going to now look at two-way tables. And so sometimes our data involves two different categorical variables. And so we call this a two-way table because it has two different variables. So it has a variable in the x direction and a y. So rows versus column, two different variables. So we might look at this. We might ask young adults, how likely is it that when you're older, you'll be rich, right? And so we asked 2,367 females and 2,459 males, how likely are you to be rich? And so some answered, they had 5 choices, almost no chance that I'll be rich, some chance, but maybe not, 50-50, a good chance, and almost certain are the 5 different responses or possible values for the variable, how likely are you to be rich when you get older? And then, so that's the one categorical variable. The other one is, are you male or are you female? All right. And you can see here that we did when we say marginal distributions, we kind of are talking about, think about the margin of a page. It's off to the right or the bottom, maybe the top and left as well. But here, when we talk about marginal totals, we mean these numbers here and these numbers here. So it's the total of the row or the total of the column. All right, so the marginal distribution of one of the categorical variables in a two-way table is going to be the distribution of the values that the variable takes on among all the individuals, but based on that one category. So that's kind of complicated, but basically marginal distribution, think about the margin again as the right margin or the bottom margin of a page. It's the distribution of everybody in the table based on what they chose as how likely they're going to be rich, or how likely or their gender. All right. In this particular situation, it doesn't make sense to use counts. We instead use percentages or relative frequencies because we had a different number of males and females. So if we really want to do a correct comparison, we need to use relative frequency or percentages. All right, so how do we do this? So we use the data in the table to calculate the marginal distribution. Again, in this case, we want to say percents of the row or the columns, depending on how we want to look at that. All right, depending on what we want to look at. So then we make a graph to display those marginal distributions. All right, so let's look. In this case, we want to just look at the variable of interest here is how likely you're going to be rich. And so we look at really the totals in the right side. We look at the marginal totals, right? These are counts, so instead we turn those into percentages. So we take each one of these totals for each of the values of the variable, and we divide it by the total number of people. And that's how we got these percentages. Okay. And this is the table we got. All right. And so again, we have percentages in this case. And in this case, we could have done counts. But generally, we're going to want percent or relative frequency. You can call this, this axis over here. We have it labeled as percent, relative frequency, but also work there. It's really more when we compare the difference between the males and the females that we have to use percentages because there's different numbers of males and females. All right, so this is a bar graph. Notice the bars are all the same width. There's gaps between them. And I guess in this case, it kind of makes sense that we put the categories in this particular order. There are some textbooks that will say, oh, you should always start with the category that is the highest frequency and then go down to the smallest frequency. But in this case, even though these are categories, there sort of is an order to them. So almost none, some, 50-50, good chance, almost certain, seems like it makes sense. And so we'll keep them in that particular order. But if you were doing something like eye color, there's no natural order, like green, blue, brown eyes, right? So in that case, we might start with the highest frequency first. Some people will tell you that you should always start with the highest frequency. All right, now a conditional distribution. So this is, again, conditional based on like, oh, male or being female. So the conditional distribution of a variable describes the value that the variable among individuals in that particular subset of the variable. So in this case, gender, for example. All right, so how are we going to compare these? Select the rows or columns of interest, and then use the data to calculate the conditional distributions. And generally we're going to do in percents because the counts aren't going to necessarily be the same. Different number of males, different number of females. So we don't want to use counts. We really want to use percents here. All right, and then we'll make a graph to display that distribution. So we're going to show you both a side-by-side and a segmented bar graph here. So let's go back to our example. We want to take just the males, for example, and we want to take the percent. In this case, we're taking the number of males who said almost no chance divided by the total number of males to get this 4%. All right, so we're not looking at dividing it by the table total, but by the total in that particular categorical values, the total for that. So the total for male, the total for female. All right, and then the next one will be for females. And so this type of graph, it's a bar graph. Males and females are labeled down below. But we put each of the other categories, we pile them on top of each other. So we call this a segmented bar graph. Okay. A legend comes in handy on the side telling us what the different colors mean. And so that is a segmented bar graph. Now, if we were going to, we could also sort of break it up and look at switch up the variable, the categorical variable. Instead of making the axis male, female, we could put in the other categorical variable. And so that's what I'm going to do in the next slide. So in this case, notice the bottom or x-axis, instead of being male, female, is the other categorical variable, how likely you are to be rich or wealthy when you get older. And then the legend now has males and females in it, the different colors that correspond. So this is an example of a side-by-side bar graph. Now notice in each of the categories, almost none, some, 50-50, those bars are touching, but between the categories there's gaps. All right, so I said, always have gaps between your bars, but not for the individual male versus female. We put those bars together, but for each of these categories, we leave a gap between each of these categories. Okay. All right, and then one word of caution, there wasn't a huge difference between males and females, but it did seem like if we look at the males, they have a higher percentage who think they were almost certainly going to be rich, or more than likely, good chance that they're going to be rich, a little higher. So if you're a male, it seems like you tend to think you have a higher chance of being wealthy when you become an adult. Not a huge difference, but there does seem to be a slight association here. However, strong associations, and in this case it's not that strong, but if you have strong associations, there may be other things that are happening. So we can't say that just because you're male, you feel more likely that you're going to be wealthy. So causation cannot be implied here, right? So strong association. So males tend to, and in this case again, it's not a strong association. There's a mild association, but even if it were strong, it does not mean that the one variable is causing the response in the other. All right, so it's not just because there's a strong association, you cannot assume causation, that it's that the one variable is causing it in the other. We'll learn in later chapters that in order to show causation, we really have to have some kind of randomized experiment to show causation. So association does not imply causation, is the takeaway from this slide. All right, and then a little bit of humor here. So the figure on the right says, I think we should give it another shot. And then the other person says, we should break up and I can prove it. And they show a graph of their relationship, and clearly it's going down. And then the first figure says, huh, and then says, maybe you're right. And then the second figure says, I knew data would convince you. And then the first person says, no, I just think that I can do better than someone who doesn't label her axes. So the whole point of this little cartoon is that make sure that you label your X and Y axes, or whatever axes you have, depending on the type of graph. A title is a good idea too. I mean, she did put a title, Our Relationship, on hers, but she did not label this axis. She did not label this axis. So, don't be someone who gets dumped by your significant other because you don't label axes. Make sure you label your axes. All right, so our first homework assignment is due next class. These are the numbers. Remember that you just go to chapter 1, the end of section 1:1, first part of the chapter, the end of the first section, and you will see homework problems number 9 all the way up to then 34. You don't have to reproduce those homework problems. You don't have to write the problem down. You just answer that in your notebook. And I will be looking at that for our next class.